Hey, it's your old anatomy professor Becky here to do a quick review of blood with you. Now, you might recall from anatomy class, this was a huge topic. I felt like this chapter just contained so many things. So I'm trying to pull out a few key points to help you study these diseases. So most of the issues with plasma, you're going to see things like fluid and electrolyte imbalances, maybe some liver issues that lead to the loss of some of these important proteins in the plasma. But most of what you're going to see in hematology or the study of blood is issues with the formed elements, the platelets, the white blood cells, the red blood cells that altogether make up about half of your blood. Now, one of the super key things that you should know is that whether you're talking about red blood cells, platelets, or those white blood cells, look at this chart. They all come from the same stem cell. Now, early on, that stem cell divides into this myeloid lineage, which you'll see making red blood cells, platelets, and the granulocytes, half your white blood cells. The lymphoid stem cells make your lymphocytes. But the thing to keep in mind is if you have something like a leukemia, where you have an overproduction of some of these white blood cells, that's using up a lot of stem cells. You could end up with problems, say, with an anemia, a lack of red blood cells. So these are all interrelated. So this might be a really helpful graph for you to come back to and remember this relationship. Okay, so let's start by looking at the red blood cells. Okay, now this chart is interested in the development. I think the main thing to keep in mind, you might see terminology like erythroblast. That's a really early red blood cell, but more likely reticulocyte. So the reticulocyte is an immature red blood cell. This is the form that's actually released into the blood. So if you're doing lab work and seeing lots of reticulocytes, that would indicate that the body is trying to improve its supply of red blood cells. Different diseases might have different reasons why that's happening, but key is understanding the role of the red blood cell, which hopefully you'll remember, right? The big deal here is that each of these cells is filled with molecules of hemoglobin. Each hemoglobin molecule carries 4 oxygen molecules, and that, of course, is the main role of hemoglobin, is to carry both oxygen and carbon dioxide in a reversible manner. Remember that one? We want those red blood cells, the hemoglobin, to pick up oxygen and CO2, but they also need to let go. They need to be able to deliver those gases as well. And so you'll be talking more about the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Good stuff. Let me know if you need help with that. Okay, last thing on red blood cells, keeping in mind that they do get recycled. You want those important proteins, those important iron molecules to get recycled. And so here we see a red blood cell that lives for about 120 days, basically being engulfed by a macrophage in the liver, spleen, or bone marrow. The iron going right back to the bone marrow to be inserted into new red blood cells. And then we have this process where the protein portion of red blood cells are actually going to go through multiple changes, but basically becoming bile in the liver, which is, of course, then put into the small intestine to help us digest fats. And that's part of what gives feces kind of that yellowish brownish color. Some of those molecules then are also sent to the kidney, and that's what gives urine its yellowish color. Okay? But the important stuff, particularly the iron, is sent back to the bone marrow. Okay, white blood cells. Not enough time to get into all of these details, but do recall your neutrophils. Those are basically phagocytic cells. They engulf a dozen or so bacteria before they self-destruct. Eosinophils, these bright pink ones, you tend to see those going after things like multicellular parasites or maybe being involved in allergies. Basophils, these are going to be full of histamine, so very important in the inflammatory response. Monocytes, these are, again, phagocytic cells. Once they leave circulation, we call them a macrophage. So don't get those two confused. They're essentially the same thing. While it's in the blood, it's a monocyte. Once it's in the tissues, we call it a macrophage. And then, of course, your lymphocytes, which are super important in that specific immune response. So again, with your white blood cells, here's our production. A couple things that you'll see really commonly is in people with lots of different infections, if they're really trying to ramp up white blood cell production to fight that, regardless of what that white blood cell is, you will see immature white blood cells being released into the blood. These are often referred to as blast cells, and so keep an eye out for that. Okay. You're probably going to talk more about a differential white blood cell count. Again, we used to do these through gram staining a blood smear and looking for what percentage of the white blood cells, say, are neutrophils. You can see those are the most common, right, by far. But say you had a patient with higher levels of eosinophils, that might indicate an allergic response or a parasitic response. So this can actually be super helpful. You'll see this come up in different diseases. Okay, last but not least, we have the platelets, right? The platelets are this weird formed element. So they're actually fragments of a cell, and that's the whole reason we call this portion of the blood formed elements instead of cells, is the platelet is just a fragment of a cell called a megakaryocyte. The big deal with platelets is their role in clotting. Okay, so remember, when a blood vessel is damaged, one of the damaged cells in that area are actually releasing some factors that attract those platelets. Platelets come, they stick, they start this platelet plug, and then the true coagulation, the true clotting is going to follow that. The platelets are actually releasing some of the chemicals that kick things off there. So platelets are really important in starting what they call the platelet plug. They're also important. They're actually able to retract the clot a little bit, like to bring the edges closer together to help the healing. And they are going to release chemicals that really kick off the true clotting cascade. Okay, and so there we see the zoomed in portion of this. Again, the key thing here is you have inactive proteins like fibrinogen at the very end of this very complicated cascade that you'll learn more about becoming fibrin, and that's what holds a true clot together. Okay, so that is blood. Hopefully that helps as you start looking at these diseases. Lots of interesting things can happen in the blood. Certain formed elements, too many, not enough, and what does that mean? So enjoy.